Action.
All right, action. Here we are. We are live, everybody. Welcome to this short preview of what we are going to be talking about. Our Marco Acevedo is going to be presenting on coming up on September 27th, which is
Right.
next Wednesday, a week from today. We're going to be doing our Strange Realities online event, possibly the last of this year before we get to the conference, which of course is a big event in and of itself. So tonight, this is a preview about what Marco is going to be talking about. And welcome to Conspiranormal, Marco, for just
Thanks.
Been a little bit.
time. Yeah.
Yeah, it has. Thanks for having me on again. I guess the last one went okay enough so that you guys were like, yeah, sure, you can do a second
No,
one.
last one was great.
Sure.
People still talk about it.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Good,
Yeah.
good. Well, I mean, I did warn you guys I was gonna probably need to come back to it and do a part 2.
Yeah.
Because it was just impossible to cover everything in that span of time. And I was on, I know, for hours, right?
Yeah, it was already one of the longest I think we had done.
Thinking back on it and looking at the tape, I'm like, you know what? This is sort of like instead of starting with chapter 1 of the book proper, it's like I started with a whole bunch of appendices, like the raw information. And so, I see my task for part 2 as wrapping it up as best I could. I mean, this could easily go to like parts 2 and 3, but like I want to move on to other subjects and stuff as much as dear to my heart as this is. But yeah, what I want to do with this one is basically encapsulate it, touch on all the different strands that all come together and then kind of come to some sort of a conclusion, or at least a coda, sort of a way of looking at this thing in the future. And of course, what I'm talking about is the flying saucer as an archetype, which is the title of my talk was and is The Spark and the Vessel. And that's one of the things I didn't actually get to do the first time. I never actually got around to explaining the title. Everything really was in the subtitle, Reverse Engineering the Flying Saucer Archetype. The Spark and the Vessel was supposed to be kind of the payoff to that. But as it turned out, it's more complicated and there's just a lot of material. But just to sort of recap where this entire thing came from, of course, there's sort of like in ufology or, the weirder sphere, there is before December 2017 and after December 2017, which is when the New York Times published their, when they released the Tic Tac and Gimbal videos and, kind of all hell broke loose. UFOs were in the zeitgeist like they hadn't been since probably 1947, except, of course, the discourse has been very narrow. The narrative has been very kind of tightly controlled, so that nowadays all people see are just sort of like, little flying dots on black and white grainy footage. And it's kind of like the opposite of the zeitgeist as it was in 1947 and in like the whole generation following that in the 50s going into the 60s and 70s. And I couldn't help but contrast the two. And it just sort of made me ask, well, why? What was it about the flying saucer that, or what was it about that era that sort of manifested the flying saucer? So, of course, I'll say at the outset, I don't hold a nuts and bolts perspective on the UFO, despite the subtitle, Reverse Engineering the Flying Saucer Archetype, because it's a play, right? It's kind of poking a little bit of fun at the nuts and bolts trope of black ops scientists and engineers analyzing, testing non-human technology to figure out how it functions, how to duplicate it, how to figure out the properties of these new heretofore unknown miraculous materials. How was this thing built, right? Whereas the kind of reverse engineering I'm talking about is like, how was this cultural artifact, how was this archetype built, right? Like what needs is it sat? What needs did the flying saucer as a particular form satisfy? And what's different now? Because I mean, what's the name of the new organization that's the sort of clearinghouse for all this stuff? Arrow, AARO.
The government one?
Yeah. That was put together by Congress.
I don't remember the latest acronym.
It doesn't really matter, but have you seen?
There was ATIP. Is that what you were thinking of?
Right. No, I think that the very new one. I think they just put up a website very recently
for the reporting and collection of data.
Yeah. I think it's Arrow, AARO.
I can't keep up, man.
I know nobody can. But what was really interesting, and I'll take their word for it, but it seems to track. They put out a chart, right? Compiling, it's a pie chart compiling UFO reports from, I think, like 1996 to now. And you see what percentages of UFO or UAP reports are described as a sphere, a tic tac, a globe, a light, and disk is like 2% of.
Marco. Hopefully we didn't lose him. Then he'll come back here. This happens sometimes.
They don't want you to know.
They don't want you to know. Yeah, that's what it is.
Hi. Back?
Okay, you are back.
You there? Okay. Yeah.
Awesome.
Okay.
As soon as you started talking about the government organizations, that's what happens.
We foiled the sense.
Yeah, that's true.
Anytime,
it's so funny because I've heard it happen a lot of times, and it's always like
that's what
it seems like a coincidence, but it's like
they jam the signal. They they get that 5G going.
It's been 2 hours, right? Do you have some missing time?
Right. Yeah, we've been waiting here for a while. We've just been chatting.
Damn, I could have done my whole presentation. Which, by the way, I'm really, really trying hard to make it not more than 2 hours. I'm actually
okay.
I'm thinking it could be an hour. I don't know.
Right.
We'll see. We'll see if I can fit it all.
It's recorded, and people can always go back to it to parse it.
And there's question and answer sessions with these too. So.
So there's it's most of the reports are like lights or spheres or orbs. Another big chunk of reports, like I think the sphere, orbs and spheres was like 47%, and like lights in the sky was like 17% or something like that. But when it came to specific forms, right? Specific concrete things like saucers, like squares, triangles, cubes, cylinders, all the stuff that we think about as comprising this sort of realm of the UFO in its multiplicity. Those are all really low numbers. No one's seeing these things anymore. It's like each of those shapes is like, I don't know, 1 or 2% of reports since 96. So that's kind of crazy. It kind of makes you sit back, So like, what was it about that time that was sort of the perfect setting for something as very specific as a flying saucer, right? And that was a question I started with. And actually, I think if you guys remember the Mystic Crew talk I did, Lonesome Saucer Blues, right?
Yeah.
That was like where it all started. And at that point, I was just looking at the immediate era of the flying saucer, the post-war era, and kind of looking at that zeitgeist and seeing like what is the connection, right? And I saw a big connection to consumer culture, right? Post-war boom, consumer culture, and I sort of came to the conclusion that that whole era, actually from about the 20s to about the 60s, I was calling it sort of the American sort of tinkerer era. Everyone seemed to be involved in technology on a kind of personal level, right? That almost no one is now. We have technology in our pockets, but we don't understand how it works. We can't pop the back on our phones and sort of rewire something. I mean, some people can, but most people can't. So there was a whole era of technology being transparent, technology being about like components, not about things locked up in a little box that you can't see. Even technicians, even like developers and coders don't really understand the physics of what's actually going on. So technology has become kind of a big mystery to us. Kind of what magic used to be now is technology, right? Look at series like Black Mirror. I mean, it's about technology, but it's about how technology has just become spooky because we can't relate to it really on a deep level anymore.
Alienation.
Dystopian.
Yeah. So, of course, Jung. Here I am talking about archetypes, and Jung, who was the granddaddy of the archetype. He asked the questions that I've started to ask, but 60 odd years ago. And he answered them pretty well in his book, Flying Saucers, a modern myth of things seen in the sky, seen in the skies. And basically, he concluded that the UFO is like a modern day mandala, right? A projection of what he calls psychic totality that was basically a response to the trauma of the times, right? Just coming off of a world war. We're now in the nuclear age, and we're now in the Cold War. Everyone's afraid of being blown up. Media's gotten big. Everyone's talking about psychology and the mind, and everything seems to be there seems to be all these sort of invisible huge forces at play that you can't really see and that you can't really control or do anything about. So there was this post-war kind of a malaise that was sort of happening, and sort of a global existential crisis, and everyone started seeing therapists at that point. So here is the father of the archetype. Here is a scholar of archetypes witnessing the birth of what apparently is a brand new archetype. He was very fascinated by the question of UFOs, of flying saucers. We were already talking about engineers, right? An engineer looks at the UFO and sees a new level of technology, a new paradigm, a new challenge, right? From an engineering perspective. Psychologist sees a new archetype. To a hammer, everything is a nail, right? Diana Pasulka recently, in the book American Cosmic, opines that for her the UFO is sort of it sort of heralds a new. She's a scholar of religion, and she sees the UFO as heralding a brand new religion, right? So everyone sees this thing through a different lens. The lens that I see this thing through is as a designer, as a graphic designer, right? I'm fascinated by the flying saucer as just a designed object, and it's sort of an icon. It is an archetype. It's it's as sort of classic as the light bulb became earlier in the 20th century. The rocket ship just became this very archetypal, very huge idea that was important to little boys reading science fiction novels, who would then grow up to be NASA engineers. It's just like this. There was these kind of ideas, archetypes really do seed the culture, but they're a new type. They're a modern kind of archetype, and the flying saucer is sort of like a perfect example of that. It's it checks all the boxes of a successful logo, right, or a brand mark. It's simple, it's streamlined, it's memorable, it's an impactful symbol. And as a designer, I found myself kind of trying to take this icon, reverse engineer it, break it down into its attributes, its associations, the narrative hooks, the cultural touch points, sort of like reversing the process by which a modern designer creates a logo or an icon for a company, right? You do research, you find out what the company's values are, what the product, if it's a product, what it does, what it hopes to mean for the consumer. It becomes an item of great significance and impact if it's successful. And that's what the flying saucer was. And man, as I said, when I first got into this, it started out being about the post-war era. And I started thinking of UFOs. When you see, think about the classic UFO chart, what kind of UFO did you see last night? And sort of this amazing chart of all these different shapes, different versions of a saucer. Some have domes on top, some are flat on the bottom. You know what I'm talking about? It's like these, and that kind of multiplicity to me it's kind of reflected the multiplicity of consumer culture post-war. It's like you look at a chart like that and you might as well be looking at like a page out of a Sears catalog showing you, every conceivable kind of hubcap for your car. It's sort of like, it's that thing. I started there and I went back further, and one thing led to another. I realized there was a deep connection between the flying saucer iconographically and the atom bomb or the mushroom cloud. Going back further, I learned about, when the atomic model became a thing, became known, became another kind of archetype. The planetary model of the atom, which is actually wrong, but because it's so classic and it's so easy to see that we still think of an atom that way. A child thinks of an atom as looking like a solar system with the nucleus and the electrons zipping around in orbits. But of course now, after, the whole quantum physics era, we know it's more complicated than that. And, the best way you can envision an atom is sort of like a nucleus enveloped in a cloud of probability. Like there's probabilities of where an electron might be at any given time. But it's, it's not set in stone. It's sort of like this sort of like numinous sort of cloud. But we still use the old model because it's helpful, because that's easy to envision. I started going back down the line, and this led me to how scientists started to talk about invisible forces in the 19th century, how that kind of, for a while, it paralleled spirituality and theosophical ideas about the nature of the universe. Scientists and philosophers were going to seances science and the woo-woo were kind of much more intermixed in the 19th century, right? All of this led me back to the Enlightenment. And if you recall, in part one of this, I really got into, of all things, the court of Louis XIV, because I was looking at that as an example of the ultimate statement of a human-controlled hierarchy, right? That gave rise to the Enlightenment, but at the same time, the Enlightenment kind of just shook the foundations, kind of like the way Einstein and then Einstein's relativity and then quantum mechanics sort of shook the foundations of what we thought the universe was about early in the 20th century. A similar thing happened in the 16th to 17th century when religious or biblical models started to go by the wayside, at least in circles of power, right? So we have that. We have all these very specific areas that I started to investigate because these are where the trails took me, right? From post-war and the whole what I call the technological imaginal of the 20th century, which grew up out of the Enlightenment, the era of the first balloonists. I found out something really fascinating, which is that before the Enlightenment, when people thought of the future, they, depending on who you were, you might have been thinking about the world after the second coming. Maybe the world is kind of a paradise, but it's from a religious perspective, right? The idea of the future being more technologically advanced than the present, and that all sorts of untold wonders will be happening because of science, because of progress. That all came out of the Enlightenment. Nobody thought of the future as this amazing technological utopia until the Enlightenment, and probably specifically until people started seeing balloonists in the sky, which sort of that shook everything up. That just sort of blew everyone's mind, and they didn't know how to process that. And so, really, after the era of the balloonists and the aeronauts, and the whole image of a human being flying through the sky, and that was the result of technology and engineering, that opened up everybody's imagination, so that then the future became this amazing place where cars fly. Maybe we can visit other planets. You could visit the bottom of the ocean. We can cure diseases. So basically, the technological, imaginal, and like science fiction, all of that sort of started right there. But you can still follow things back, and so there's a whole realm of sort of like mythic archetypal material that I think has some bearing on the flying saucer, and that I kind of touched on in part one. Mm-hmm. But I'll have a lot more of that in part two. Yeah, and I'll be, I guess you could say that the material sort of divides into sort of a exoteric realm and an esoteric realm, right? Mm-hmm. The exoteric is are all of this surface associations of the flying saucer as an archetype, which involves more recent history, which involves the post-war era, the bomb, consumerism, and then we go, there's material that goes back to the founding myths of like Delphi, you know, the and Greek mythology and the sort of hierarchy that existed within Greek mythology, that there was an underworld and that there was a world above. You know, Zeus was up on his mountain and his icon was the eagle. And the serpent kind of represented sort of like the totality of nature, mysterious and not mysterious, on, you know, on the earthly plane and below. And so this is like this becomes a cosmological archetype, and that ties into the flying saucer. At least I think so. I promise. I'll show you how it happens.
No, and I just want to say that, you know, you use your artistic and design talents to
Right.
really weave the narrative together, and it's a very visual presentation, I'm sure, as the last one was. So just that alone is, you know, would make like I think we talked about like a fascinating coffee table book you could make out of this.
Yeah, if somehow I could get past all of the you know, the rights to all the
Right.
images. I figure in a presentation, you know, the resolution's small, it's all, you know, it's all free, it's all fair use.
Sure.
Yeah, but a nice book would be amazing to put together. Anyway, I mean, that's the gist of it. That's the gist of what's going to happen next week.
Awesome. Part 2. And if you sign up for our Patreon at patreon.com/conspiranormal and join the Mystic Crew to be able to view this, you can also go back and watch part 1 of Marco's talk and then put it all together.
Yep. I may have to put out a map. I mean, it's a lot of stuff.
Right. And I'm putting that right there on, that's the link to our patreon.com/conspiranormal. You guys join the $10 level at that is the Order of the Mystic Crew, like Sir Fiel said. You guys can get in. If you don't want to do that, there is going to be an Eventbrite link as well. If you pay just the $10, $10 one-time thing. So that will be available too. But easiest way to do it, and you can go back and you can watch The Vessel and the Spark Part 1, Sparking the Vessel Part 1. You guys can go back and watch that because that is on our Patreon. And we have all the rest of these monthly meetups that we do that is also on the Patreon. So there's like plenty of stuff to go back and watch. So would definitely recommend taking that route and joining the $10 level Patreon because there's a ton of material on there for you guys.
It's great stuff. It's a really great archive of all sorts of interesting things under the sun. So yeah, I'm glad to be part of it, and I'm excited about next week.
Absolutely. All right, Marco. Thank you for hanging out with us. And guys, hope you can join us. That is 8 p.m. Eastern time. So figure out what time zone you're in. And on September 27th, the week from tonight. Thank you guys for watching.
All right.